I need to tell you about myself. I'm going to speak about myself, so all the introductions it said so much about me already. But I was once asked to speak, and the rabbi asked me what my biography is. And I told him, I'm not a speaker. I don't have a biography. This is what I say. This is what I talk about. And so just tell them my name and tell them that I was a teacher in the LA Unified School District for 39 years, and I was a survivor of the Holocaust. And I'll tell them the rest. So he got up and said, here is Leyson. He survived the Holocaust and 39 years of the LA Unified School District. It's very dangerous to be introduced. So what I'm going to do is tell you about my experiences during the Holocaust, especially about my family and how we survived the war, how I ended up on Schindler's List, and something in between. To begin with, the first 9 years of my life I lived in a small town in eastern Poland, northeastern Poland, near the Russian border, stuck away. Nobody even knew where that was. Even the Polish people, if you asked them where Narewka is, they wouldn't know, unless you told them it's near Białystok. That's where it was. And so my whole family lived in this small town. In those days, people didn't move a whole lot. And everyone who was related to me lived in the town. But my father left because of his job, and the factory where he worked, he was a tool die maker, had moved to Krakow, and so he left, and eventually he brought us over to Krakow. So just the immediate family came to Krakow. There were 5 children in my family. My parents had 2 boys, then a girl, then 2 more boys. I was the last one. And so when I came to Krakow, I was 9 years old, and coming from a small town like Narewka, which was a town without running water, without electricity and all that, it was just a small town. It was something like what you saw in Fiddler on the Roof without the Hollywood stuff. And so coming to a city like Krakow, which is a very beautiful city, it used to be the capital of Poland one time when it was Poland was a kingdom, and so it had lots of parks and monuments and things to see, and streetcars right down the middle of the street that were fascinating. I never saw something that's moving by itself without horses pulling it. And so after I got some friends my age, we were playing games on these streetcars. They looked a little bit like the San Francisco cable cars. They had platforms on either end. And there was a conductor who used to sell tickets. And then we'd watch the conductor see where he was, and we'd get on as far away from him as possible and go a few stops, and he would get closer and closer, and then we'd get off. We got really close, and then we'd get on the other end and ride a few more stops, just to see how far we can go without paying. It was 5 groszy, and we didn't even have that. And so I was exploring the city for a year, and then the war began. Germany invaded Poland in 1939, and as soon as they came to Krakow, they began the campaign against the Jewish people. A campaign that began to marginalize the people from the rest of the population. And it was some of the regulations. They began with a bunch of restrictions against the Jews. Some of them were just meaningless, really. but it was just the beginning. So I was taking cues from adults. I was 10 years old, and the adults were saying every time one of these restrictions was announced, they said, "Oh, that's nothing, we can live with that. The war's not going to last very long, and everything's going to go back to normal." And you know, people like my parents' age remembered the Germans in World War I. And they came to Poland and invaded Poland and occupied it and lost the, stayed for 4 years, lost the war and left. They didn't pick on any particular population or group of people for any special treatment. So they expected the Germans to be the same this time, but they weren't. And so as these restrictions were announced each time, meaningless ones, I'll tell you a few of them. Poland, Krakow has many parks, and so you could go from one end of the city, just go through parks from one park to the other. And so they announced that Jews who go to the parks, and I mean this is serious, this is not just a joke, this is big signs all over the city that said, Jews who go to the parks are not permitted to sit on the bed. It's pretty dumb, 10 years old, what did I care? It meant nothing. And after a while, another sign, another order, Jews are not allowed to go to the parks, period. And so they had to go from one place in the city to another, they had to go to a prescribed route. Heaven forbid that they would cross the square, the main square in Krakow, which was called Main Square before the war, but the Germans renamed it Adolf Hitlerplatz, and of course you didn't want the Jews to step on that. And so, and then each time that something like this was announced, my parents and the adults were saying, we're used to this kind of thing. It's not so new for Jews to be persecuted back in our history. So, and this isn't anything, it's meaningless really. And the war's not going to last very long. And so the streetcars, my favorite things to play with. They decided that Jews were not allowed to take public transportation, but at first they did. At first they allowed Jews to take the streetcar. They strung a rope in the middle of the streetcar. And the back was for Jews, front for non-Jews. Big sign on the side that said, für Juden, für Nicht-Juden, für Żydów, für Nie-Żydów, for Jews, non-Jews. And so, after a while, they took the rope off and Jews were not allowed to take public transportation altogether. But this reminds me, every time I think about that, is that this is only a way to put people down. It has nothing to do with going where you want to go, because everybody gets to where you're going at the same time, regardless of where you're sitting. It's just a way to put people down. Many years later, when I came to this country, I was drafted in the Army after almost 2 years in this country. I was drafted during the Korean War, and I was sent to the South for basic training. And the first 2 years I was in this country, I didn't have a car. I used to ride buses all the time. And I went to school, and I went to work, and I went to school, and I went to work. That's all I did for the first 2 years. Trying to learn English, trying to improve my skills, and trying to get a better job. So I worked and I went to school. And at night, midnight, I would get in the bus, go home, get in the back, and go to sleep. And then the bus driver would wake me up and tell me where I should get off. He said, "Oh, Leon, this is your stop, get off here." So it was routine. And so now I am in Atlanta, Georgia, Atlanta General Depot, outside of the city. After a certain amount of basic training, certain weeks, they gave us passes to go into town. So this time I'm just private first class Leyson, not little Leon. Got my brass shine, I'm ready to go to town. And so the first thing I did, they provided a bus, a little shuttle. I just got the bus, got in the back, sat down, and waited. The bus started up. Pretty soon, it didn't go very far, I stopped. the bus driver got out of his seat and came over to me and told me, "You can't sit here. You have to go sit in the front. This is reserved for blacks." I didn't know what he was talking about first. You know how sometimes somebody says something to you, it's instant, and you just kind of don't register it. It didn't register right away. I said, God, it was not long ago that I was supposed to sit in the back and somebody else in the front. Now I'm supposed to sit in the front, somebody else in the back. I was stupid. And as I said, it's one thing to sit in the back if you want to, and it's something else altogether when you have to sit in the back. In the meantime, back in Krakow, this is just an aside, I just never can forget that. Back in Krakow, they continued their restrictions, and my father lost his job for which he came to Krakow in the first place. And along with the invading armies came a whole group of young officers, deserted in the eyes of the Nazis, who came to Poland to make their fortune, which is a good place to come. There's one thing they do is to strip Poland of its wealth. And this time they stripped Poland of its wealth, especially Jewish property, and gave it to these young officers who distinguished themselves in the German service. One of them was Oskar Schindler. He came to Krakow and he took over a factory that was Jewish-owned before the war, and it happened to be just the one right across the street from my father's original job for which he came to Krakow in the first place. And so when Schindler got his factory and he looked for employees, he found out that my father, there was a craftsman, doesn't have a job, and he needed people like him, so he hired him. So my father was the first Jewish worker that Schindler hired. And then he hired more and more, as you know, and eventually hired quite a few more. But in the beginning, my father was one of the first Jews that Schindler hired. And of course he wasn't getting paid, but there was an advantage in having a job in a place like Schindler's company, because the Nazis continued with their restrictions, and eventually they established a ghetto and forced all the Jews to go back. They took a small area of town, surrounded it with these high walls, much like the ones you saw in that strip. That was a gate. It was near my building. Where I lived was just inside of that gate. 12-foot walls all the way around, and the Christian population had to move out, and all the Jews had to move in. The difference between the number of people that moved out was about 3 to 1, so about 3 times as many Jews moved into that same small area, and we were really crowded. And plus, they didn't allow very provisions into the ghetto, so the ghetto became a place of insanity. Just shortages of food began right away as soon as they came, even outside of the ghetto. But in the ghetto, it was my memory as a child in the ghetto. I was preoccupied the whole time with finding food. Every day you just could see if I can find something to eat. But my father had a job at Schindler's company, so he had a permit to leave the ghetto, a special permit. The factory wasn't very far from the ghetto. So he would leave, and then on the way home, he would smuggle some things in his pockets. He gave some of his suits and some of his possessions to one of his buddies from before the war. And periodically I made contact with him and asked him to trade it for food. And he would just smuggle it in, little by little, and this is how we lived from day to day. And I was always looking for something to eat. My oldest brother, there was my brother Herschel, then Sally, then my sister Aviva, then my brother David and I. The oldest brother actually escaped the invasion and ended up back in Marevka with his grandparents. That part of Poland was occupied by the Soviets. I think most of you probably know the history where the Nazis invaded Poland in two phases. First, they stopped at the River Bug. The Russians came in and occupied the eastern part. And then after the ghetto was created about the same time, they invaded the rest of Eastern Europe, went through that area very quickly, through the Ukraine, the Belarus, and just ended up in front of Moscow and Stalingrad and so on. Behind those invading armies came special troops, and their job was to find, their only job was to find Jews who lived in these eastern parts of Europe, in these small towns like my hometown, and murder them. That's their only job. So they had several battalions of soldiers who operated in different areas, and this is what their job was. And this was around a little bit after the ghetto was created. Of course, we were separated from our extended family, so we were not aware of what was going on at that particular time. So after the second invasion, some of these troops came through my hometown, actually 2 months after the invasion, surrounded it, drove the Jewish people out of their homes, murdered the men that day, and buried them in a common grave. The women and children were held for a few more days in a barn, and they too were murdered. So as a result of this action of this one battalion of soldiers, everyone who was related to me in Poland, including my oldest brother, those of us who were in Krakow, including my oldest brother who escaped the Nazis in the first place, were murdered. So there were 5 of us left in the ghetto. My brother went to work in Schindler's company, where Schindler were adding more people to his factory, and my father asked him to add my brother, and so my brother David, who was next to me, about 2 years older than I, and he went to work, and he too had a chance to smuggle in something in his pockets on the way home. My sister went to work in another company just like Schindler's, and eventually those people who worked in these companies that were operated by these German officers who were given factories to run, they then moved out of the ghetto to a place called Planchów, which is a concentration camp that they had built about 3 kilometers from Krakow. So my father and my brother went to live there. My sister went to live in another camp just like Schindler's. And for a period of time, Schindler's employees, by that time they had quite a few people working for him, Schindler's employees were leaving for work from the camp, so they had to be escorted under guard and then escorted back. And Schindler was able to persuade the authorities to let him build a sub-camp so that these people would not be wasting time, walking back and forth. They would be living right next to the factory where they could be more efficient and so on. And so he was able to persuade them. Of course, he started to spend some of that money that he came to make in order to accomplish it. And so my father and my brother went to live in this sub-camp. And my sister went to live in another company just like Schindler's, called Kalberwerk. My mother and I were in the ghetto until the ghetto was closed. Of course, the Nazis did not put us in this ghetto in order to isolate it from the rest of the population. As most of the adults were thinking, as most normal people would imagine, no one could have imagined what the Nazis had in mind. But what they really had in mind was the end result was going to be that we were all going to die. And what better way to do this than to have all the Jews all in one place? So they began to transport. Of course, after they had been roaming around the eastern part of Poland, shooting people in hundreds and hundreds of little towns like mine, it became too burdensome of that, too slow. And so the good Nazi German technology and German engineering, they designed places where they could murder people by the hundreds of thousands. More efficiently than just getting these people to shoot. And so as soon as those factories were established, they began to transport people out of the ghettos to these death camps. And the first transport that was formed, the Nazis, played games. They enjoyed this whole thing. It was pretty amusing to them. They announced that there was going to be a transport formed where Jews could get out of the ghetto and go to the countryside where they would get fresh air, get jobs, and food, and also alleviate the congestion in the ghetto, which was considerable. We had to share one bedroom with other families and all that. And that made very good sense to normal people. But the problem was that they were lying just a little bit. These people who were being taken on these transport were not going to be getting fresh air. They were going to be gassed and burned. And so when the first transport went out, most people really, many of them volunteered to go. Who wouldn't want to leave this place of insanity? For one thing, it was always, my memory of the ghetto was a place where I was scared all the time, and I was hungry all the time. So I was, always looking for food, and always, it was one of those places where if you inadvertently didn't get off the sidewalk and let an army officer pass through, you might get beaten up if you're lucky, or killed. So the life is in danger all the time. And, if I were to tell you how many times my life was in danger, we would have to spend a whole lot more time than we have. But I was, shot at. My friend and I was shot at. And of course, he missed. I'm here. Mm-hmm. But I have been the luckiest person on this planet because there were so many times where my life was, if I had done something else other than what I did, I would be here to tell you this. And so, most of you have seen Schindler's List, I believe. So, you know my whole story. And you've seen one of those transports depicted in the movie. And it was a real transport that is still a movie, but it was an actual transport where Schindler discovered that his accountant, by that time he had quite a few people working for him, he had an accountant, and the accountant was taken on this transport because he didn't have his blue slip. Blauschein. They played games there too. The first time you were exempted from the transport if you got a stamp on your ID card. Next time it was if they attached a blue slip to your ID card. And so, anyway, when he went and get his accountant off, and that they did Schindler found the accountant, got him off the train, and when they were looking for him, they called for Stern. Stern went through the railroad cars to look for him. And Stern got off, Schindler got him off, and Stern survived the war with us on Schindler's List at the end. But in the movie, it can't show you everything, so what you didn't see was that when Schindler was looking for his accountant, as they were looking through the railroad cars, Schindler saw my then second oldest brother. You know what happened to my first oldest brother. He died in Eastern Europe. He was on this transporter. Schindler offered to get him off the train. And my brother declined to get off because Schindler couldn't get off his girlfriend off. And my brother there with his girlfriend, and he couldn't get her off. So my brother decided that he would stay with her. And that was the last decision he's made. They both ended up in Belgius at the end of the line in the death camp. I just want you to know that the Nazis did not kill numbers. 6 million is meaningless. They killed individual people. Somebody's brother, somebody's sister, somebody's uncle and aunt. They killed individual people, not numbers. Somebody like my brother, he was the one I knew best because my oldest brother had left quite early, and he was there with us in the ghetto. And I could spend the rest of the evening telling you about him. He was talented. He was a nice young man who had a girlfriend, and I was a pest. I was just hanging around him all the time. But he never asked me to get lost or anything. It's not like my brother next to me, he was teasing me all the time. But this guy was just a great young man. As you can see, he decided to stay with his girlfriend instead of leaving, saving himself. And so back in the ghetto, they kept forming more and more transports, and eventually the ghetto was going to be emptied altogether and closed. By the way, I don't know, I should have described to you the walls that they built around the ghetto. These high walls. Just with a little Nazi humor, they decided they would build the walls really high. And then at the top of the wall, they had these semicircular shapes. So it made it look like a whole bunch of cemetery grave markers. Just, for a little amusement. And so, they also ran the shops in the ghetto. People worked in different places, shoemakers, tailors, all these different crafts. I was in a brush factory. I finally got a job in a brush factory. I made brushes. And when they were liquidating the ghetto, when they finally decided the ghetto was going to be closed, they announced that everyone should line up according to their factories where they worked in front of the gate so they can be escorted to the Plaszow, to this concentration camp. And so I lined up with my group, and I got to where just about where the gate was. There was a guard standing there, and he pulled me out and he said, "Oh, you come later." And I was little. I didn't grow very much until the war was over. So coming later didn't look good to me, even though I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. We had an attic in the back of our apartment, and we escaped one of the transports. And so they decided they were going to do that again. And I decided no. So I lined us, I joined another group. They really didn't know whether I was a brush maker or a shoemaker, and so I got into another group and started walking, and I got pulled out again once, and maybe twice. And one time the guard wasn't looking. I made it right through. And I made it out of the ghetto, which was a place like like the frying pan and into this concentration camp, which is like the end of the world. When I got there, I was always pessimistic about surviving. But when I got to this camp, barbed wire all around, people yelling, dogs barking, barracks as far as the eye could see, and I thought to myself, here, we're not going to get anywhere. This is to be the last stop. It looked like the end of the world. I spent the rest of the year in that camp under the commandant who used to shoot people from the balcony. Well, they all did this. In the movie it shows mostly him, but in real life, let me just give you a little idea about one day in the life of the Plaszow camp. We would all have to come out of our camp, the barracks, and line up according to the barracks and stand there in the assembly area. And these Nazis would roam them through the ranks and beat people up, sometimes kill somebody beat somebody up. Usually when they started beating somebody, they would eventually kill them. And every morning it was the same thing. We would stand there for hours, it was still dark, and they would roam the air in the ranks and pull people out. Just random. So, somebody like me is standing there and is just knowing that there's one of them coming across, and I was always hoping that he would continue to keep on going. But I was not always that lucky when it was time when they decided they were going to whip people, just give people 25 lashes. So they just started picking people up, sending them over to where they were handing out the lashes. And then they got tired of picking one at a time. They just said, this row, move forward, and I was in one of them. And so I received my set of 25 lashes. When I think about that kid receiving 25 lashes from this big Ukrainian guard, just breaks my heart. It was me, but I think of myself as somebody else when this is going on. And so, in the meantime, Schindler was adding more people to his company because now we had a sub-camp and we wanted more employees. My father asked him to add my mother and me to the list. And so I got on the list. There was a mini Schindler list. About 35 of us were going to be added to this sub-camp that Schindler was running. And so a few days before we were supposed to be escorted out under guard to Schindler's company out of this place that was a complete hell. I found out that my name was crossed out. Somebody lined my name off, and that I was not going to go another way. I tried to find out why they did this, but nobody paid much attention to me. As a little kid, I said, get lost, They restarted the brush factories, they go back to the brush factory. And so on the day that they were going to leave, I slipped away from my job and went to see my mother off. Something happened. Normally, if you walked along aimlessly in the camp, you'd get beaten up if you're lucky, or killed, because you had to have an excuse and reason to go somewhere. So I'm walking like this, and then pretty soon I got to where they were, near the gate. And nobody saw me, nobody stopped me. And I could hear them talking, already, and they were looking, they saw me, and I waved to my mother. And I don't know, the last few steps I took, I can't even tell you, I can't even remember them. But I found myself in front of this huge officer, Nazi officer, who was in charge of going to escorting the group to Schindler's company. And so I stood in front of him, and I was afraid to look up. My eye level was about even with his belt buckle. And I told him my name, and then I said my name was on this list, and somebody crossed it out. And then I said to him, and my mother is on this list, and she's in this group. I'm talking to a man that doesn't even think I'm human. I'm telling him about my family. Then I even said that, and not only that, but my father and my brother are already there. Even then I thought, that's just really dumb. I shouldn't have said that. But as I said earlier, I've been lucky all my life, and this was just one of those things that you have to be very unlucky before you know you're really fortunate. Somehow he asked the assistant to see the list, looked at it, saw my name there, looked at me, and just grunted. I jumped in that group as fast as I could and made myself smaller than I was, and didn't want to ask any questions. And it seemed like we stood there for a long time, but we probably wasn't. But I could hear the officer and his assistant, they were talking about something, looking at the list and all that. And I was afraid he might change his mind. But he didn't, and we started out, and I ended up in Schindler's company. If that hadn't happened, I would not have survived the war. There's no way somebody like me, my age, could have survived by himself in Auschwitz, where most people were taken to Auschwitz afterwards. In Schindler's company, because I knew a little bit about the kind of work my father used to do before the war, and so I knew at least where the handles were, so that when they tried us out on different jobs, and they tried me out on one of those, and somebody in front of me couldn't do it, but I could, so they said, okay, that's your job. So I stood there in front of this machine for 12 hours every night shift. But I was too short. So I used to stand on a box about 8 inches high, upside down, so I could reach the controls better. And Schindler had a habit of visiting the company, visiting the factory after all his guests would leave. He entertained all the time in his office, all these officers and all these, people that he would bribe. And after they left, he would come down and visit this factory. I think you saw that a little bit of it in the movie. But he did that often. And sometimes he'd stop and talk to people. And here's where you could see the difference between a Nazi who accepted the ideology that some people are less worthy of life than others. The Nazis were the Übermenschen, and everybody else was somewhere below them. And so they treated us that way because we were on the bottom, non-human. But not Schindler. You could tell by the way he stopped. He used to talk to us in complete sentences. Some would stop and talk to me. We didn't have a whole lot in common. Schindler had a lot of things to worry about, like making a lot of money and taking care of all these girlfriends and all this other stuff. And he would stop and talk to me, ask me how I was doing. Not that he wanted to know, he just wanted to make human contact. That's because that kind of a person he was. And sometimes after those visits, when I went to get my ration of food the next day, I discovered that Schindler left word that I should receive 2 rations. Think about it. He had to remember seeing me. Of course, he'd been partying half the night. Then he had to remember that he'd seen me. The next day, go find the person who handed out the rations, and then tell him to give me 2. He's an extraordinary human being. And he did that numerous times, often. You could tell the difference by the way, as I said, by the way he spoke to us, and also the way he treated us, especially the Leysons. We were 4 of us by then. My sister was not, it was in another camp. one day when I was kind of interested in all this mechanical stuff that was going on in the factory. So I was standing there looking at something that they were doing on this machine. They were changing from one operation to another, and I wanted to see how they did this. So I'm standing there watching and away from my work. And then I could tell Schindler was in the room, in the factory, because he used to smoke his cigarettes. You could smell them from a mile away. And, but I froze, I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there. He went right by me, behind me, didn't say a word. And as soon as he was out of sight, I went back to my work. And sometimes later, Schindler left word that my brother and I should be transferred from where we were working to another section of the factory where they're making dyes and a higher level of work. We were doing production work, and this was a higher level of work. Just to give you an idea, the Nazis thought of us, even when we worked, that we're just going to work until we died. The purpose of our working was to kill us. In his case, he thought, this kid is interested in something like this, maybe he should be learning something more advanced. I thought maybe I had a future. That's different from any Nazi ideology. Just, I have so many incidences where, like my encounters with Schindler, that because of that, I think that Schindler was actually a genuine hero. Because at the time that he was doing this, the norm was to murder Jews, not to save them. What Schindler was doing was actually against the law. Imagine that. Saving Jews was against the law. He could get in a lot of trouble. And he did. He took a lot of chances, he was gambled a lot, and he did get arrested several times, but he talked himself out of it, bribed somebody, and he was back. But he says, a man you could tell that did not accept the Nazi ideology. If I brought somebody like Schindler, stand on one side, and somebody who was a Nazi, died in the wall, accepted the ideology, you could tell the difference by just looking at it. People like that had nothing behind their eyes. They had this ideology, and there's just no soul. This reminds me that during that whole period of time, there's some people think that Jews did not, they didn't do anything. They were just, they didn't try to save themselves, but they did. Everybody did. Just by maintaining your humanity, we did. And there were many people with many talents. There were singers and professors and doctors and all kinds of Jews, And those who had talent performed. Some people actually, you wouldn't know this, but in the camp, people sang songs and they recited poetry. It's all part of resistance. And told jokes. There were kind of gallows jokes, but nevertheless jokes. Sang songs that were some dark songs like that, with lots of irony in it, but still, that's part of the resistance. So I'm going to tell you one of the jokes. It was a Nazi who'd been roaming around the eastern part of Poland, in the eastern part of Europe, shooting people on a daily basis. And after a while, the thrill was gone, and he was not enjoying it very much anymore. And he had this Jew in front of him. He was going to shoot him. He thought maybe he'd have a little fun. So he told the Jew that he had one glass eye that was made by this wonderful German world-renowned technologist, technical stuff. And he made an eye that nobody can tell the difference between the real eye and the glass eye. But if this Jew could tell which one was the glass eye, and he let him live. And so the Jew looked at each one of his eyes, and then he said, pointed to one, he said, this one. And the Nazi was amazed. He said, yeah, that's right. How did you guess this? So here's the punchline. The Jew says, I looked at each one of your eyes, and in one of them, I saw a little glimmer of humanity, and I knew that was glass. And so even Schindler, he couldn't keep all the people in his factory, and when the war was going badly for the Germans on the Eastern Front, the Russians were going to be in Krakow soon. And so those people like him who came to Krakow to make their fortune and make money, send all their employees back to the Ploshov concentration camp. Like my sister, she was sent back. And they just took their money and ran. But Schindler decided he would do something else. But even at the time when the rumor was that what he was going to do, that he was going to have the factory dismantled, have the machinery taken apart, and transfer it to Czechoslovakia, and then take his employees with him, even I thought it was, he's never going to make it. They would never let him do that. And as a matter of fact, when he proposed this, at first the Nazi, the officials told him that, why drag these Jews from here to there? Why we give you a bunch of Jews? We got lots of prisoners over on that end. We'll give you all the ones you want. No, he insisted that he has to have those people and from his factory who were experts in everything. They were really experts. And so he was able to persuade him by doing a lot of bribing. He spent a lot of his money to do this. And so the factory was going to be dismantled and actually transferred to Czechoslovakia, which I didn't even know had happened because from the movie. But during that period of time, when the factory was being taken apart and nothing was being manufactured, he couldn't keep all his people. He could only keep part of his employees, or part of the group. So somebody made up a list of who's going to stay and who's going to dismantle the machinery and who's going to leave back to Ploshov. When the list was made up, my father, my brother, and I were going to be sent away, and my mother was going to stay. She was going to take a machinery part, I guess. Who made up the list? And I know it wasn't Schindler. And so we were already standing there, and they always had, these Nazis had a habit of letting us stand there for a long time and counting us back and forth, looking around. So we stood there for a while, and each time I had to line up, and we had to line up in rows of 4, I would always line up in the back because I was little and I didn't want to be conspicuous. So and this time I was in the back, and as we were standing there already, Schindler came. She came over to see who was leaving. So he's walking back and forth in front of this group, in front of us, and I want to get his attention. But I was little and I was in the back row, so I started to move out of my row to the end of the group where when he came my direction, I could, get his attention. I had this thermos bottle that somebody gave me, one of the families that came to live with us, German refugees, came to Poland and ended up in Krakow with us, and we shared a room. The man and the wife were taken on one of the transports. The man gave me this thermos bottle. He said, he always promised to take me to America after the war, but he didn't survive, neither did his wife. And so I had this thermos bottle, and as I was moving out of my row, there was a guard standing behind me, which I didn't see, and he walked up and hit me with his rifle butt, broke the bottle, made a big noise, and everybody looked in my direction, which is fine, because Schindler looked, and I called out to him. I told Schindler that my father, my brother, and I are being sent away. And he immediately ordered us, all three of us, out of that group and told us to go back to the group, join the group that was staying. He saved our lives then. Because we would not have, if the war had lasted much longer, we would not even survive the Schindler's List. But surviving in Mauthausen or in Buchenwald, someplace like that, which was where those people were sent eventually, there would not have been a chance. So anyway, he saved our lives, and that was a wonderful thing. He did a great thing. But he did something that's more remarkable, just to give you an idea of what kind of a human being he was. Before we were able to get to the other group, he got there first. And he found my mother there and told her not to worry that we were coming. And that's, as we say, is beyond the call of duty. It's something that you do because you're a fine human being, which he was. And a hero as well, because as I said, this was pretty dangerous stuff. So I have a definition of a hero that I borrowed from Joseph Campbell, who was an author of The Power of Myth. He was interviewed on PBS one time, and I heard him describe a mythical hero. He gave a definition of one. When I heard it, I knew that belonged to Schindler. And it went something like this. A hero is an ordinary human being who does the best of things in the worst of times. And that's what he did. The times could not have been worse, and what he did couldn't have possibly been better. And eventually, as you know from the movie, we all were transferred to Czechoslovakia. The women were sent to Auschwitz, as you know, and the men were sent through Gross-Rosen. Same experience. We had the same experience in Gross-Rosen as the women had in Auschwitz. But as a movie can't show you everything, and besides, I guess it wouldn't be too interesting to see a bunch of naked men standing around all night long in the wintertime, it's just probably more interesting to see the women. Anyway, you know that the women who came to Auschwitz, by the way, my father asked Schindler to add my sister to the list at that point, because she was sent back from her company to the main camp. He added her to the list as well. So she and her mother were on the way into Auschwitz, and as you know, they have a selection. When you get to Auschwitz, somebody stands there and decides who's going to live, who's going to die, pointing to the right and the left. So when my sister approached him, he sent my sister to live, my mother to die. So she was already in the barracks awaiting the gas chamber when Schindler discovered that not all the women who were on his list were being sent to his factory. He went and bribed more people, spent more money, and insisted that all women on his list must be sent to him. At that point, my mother was taken out of the barracks and joined the Schindler's women. I want you to know this happened in 1944. in 1944, my mother was 42. Already worthless, beat up. She was. She suffered a lot. When I think about how much my parents suffered as compared to what I suffered as a child, as much my parents as parents, not for us, even though, they tried. It was tremendous. When I first came to, I got out of the ghetto into Plaszow. When they found out that I made it, everybody was happy because I survived another day. But during that period of time, it was early in the camp. The camp was not completely finished yet, not solid. So the division between the men and the women was not too well established yet. So I snuck through the wires, and at that time in my life, you couldn't tell whether I was male or female. And I went to find my mother. I found her in one of the barracks. And as soon as she saw me off, she was happy and immediately started pushing out the door fast so I would not get in trouble, which was her job. And before I left, she reached over to where she was sleeping underneath those rags. She pulled out a little piece of bread about the size of a walnut, a dried little piece, and gave it to me. It's the best she had. The more that's the best she could do. That's all she had. And so we, as I said, we went through the same thing in Gross-Rosen as the women in Plaszow. But we got to Schindler's Company first, and the women followed us. And there was several weeks before the women came. And I remember standing upstairs, looking through a window, watching the women come into the camp. They looked so terrible, but it was a beautiful sight to see. All shorn, wearing rags. And so we spent the rest of the war for about 8 months at Schindler's Company in Czechoslovakia. Those were pretty hard times because Schindler was not able to provide additional provisions, and the soup was getting thinner, and the portions of bread were smaller. And we were not going to survive if the war had lasted much longer anyway. But at the end of the war, as you know, Schindler had to escape. He didn't want to be rescued caught by the Soviets. We were liberated by the Soviet army, and so he left, and a few of our people escorted him. And you remember the scene in front of the car where, as I told you earlier, we had lots of different people with different skills. And so we had jewelers and people that could make a ring. And they did make a ring out of one of the people's gold crown, and gave it to him. And inscribed it, as you've already heard earlier, with a saying from the Talmud that he who saves a life saves the world entire. And that's very fitting to give it to somebody like Schindler. And we're always talking about Schindler saved 1,200 Jews, but he saved a whole lot more than that. When you think about the future generations that are going to be here as a result of what Schindler did, the ripple effect is incalculable. And so a little bit more about Schindler. He was just a special kind of person. Towards the end of the war, when things were getting kind of loosened up and the warehouses were not being guarded as well as they were, the German guards were running for their lives, Schindler got a truck and went to one of the warehouses, and he got hundreds of bolts of cloth, navy blue cloth, and hundreds of bottles of vodka, and brought it into the camp. And you know, before he left orders that everyone who leaves the camp should get a bolt of cloth and a bottle of vodka. You'd be amazed how prescient that was. You know, when we left, we had nothing. It wasn't like the movie where the music goes up, the movie changes from black and white to color, and everybody goes off singing, Yerushalayim. No. That didn't happen. We were stunned, we didn't know what to do, but they provided transportation for us if we wanted to go back where we came from. And it was a similar train like the one we came on, except this time the railroad cars were open, not locked, you know. And so we would go through and we would get off the nearest to where we lived. And so we went back to Krakow. And that was not a really good thing to do. And as it turned out, you know, even so, my father actually got his job back. But it wasn't a very good idea. Anyway, the bolts of cloth. Well, we could exchange that for food. We exchanged it for all kinds of things. Like, for example, my first civilian pair of pants were made out of navy blue, and we gave the rest of the bolts of cloth to the tailor for his work. And the bottles of vodka, we didn't drink it, so we traded for food and for other things that we could. It's like having money in your pocket. But the thing, the return to Poland was not a happy moment. Immediately it began. I don't want to get into it too far away. It was pretty nasty. You know, actually people got killed after the war, after surviving the Holocaust. They actually got killed coming back to Poland. In the city of Kielce, there were something like 60 people who murdered after they had survived the war. In Krakow, my father, as I said, he got his job back. And one day, one of his buddies came and said, "Look, Leyson, don't go home today. It's too dangerous for Jews to walk the street. You might get beaten up." So he stayed overnight in the factory because there was rioting in the streets of Krakow against the returning Jews from the camps. So with that, my sister and my brother went back to Czechoslovakia to see if it would be better to settle there. And that was not good anyway, so in 1948, they left and went to Israel. In the meantime, my mother decided she lost her whole family. She lost her 2 oldest sons. Their next 2 went off to Israel. She should have at least one. That was me, the youngest. So I stayed with them. And we, the 3 of us, escaped from Poland, and we ended up in Germany in a displaced person camp for the next 3 years. While we were there, we gave our name to organizations that did searches, family searches, and we had family in this country. My mother had a sister and a brother who came to this country in the early 1900s. And they had already discovered what had happened to their families in Poland, and they assumed that everyone had died, except one day somebody came and told them that there's a possibility that in Wetzlar, Germany, in a displaced person camp, there are 3 people that might be related to her. And it turned out, of course, it was their sister. And they started corresponding with us, and it took till 1949 before we were able to get to this country. They had to provide all the papers and everything. They had to vouch for us. That we would, for 3 things. We would have a place to stay, we had a job, and not be a burden on the government. I want to announce it today that from day one, we were never a burden on the government. We went to work almost the following week after we got here. And so when I came to this country, I just knew that I was in a whole different place in the world. Just everything was just different. And it's part of my continuous good fortune to come to this country, because I would not have been given an opportunity to do what I did any place else in the world. Imagine, my education was interrupted when I was 10 years old, and didn't pick up until I came back out of the service in the United States. After a couple of years I was drafted, as you already know. And then when I came out, got out of the service, I went to a community college, and I said, I want to go to school. The counselor said, fine. Where'd you go to high school? Started interrogating me, and I said, no, I didn't have this, and I didn't have any papers, I didn't have any records. But he knew I was in the service, and I was in the Army Engineers, and my experience, and he said, with your experience, how was your English? I said, well, it's pretty good. By that time, I had been in the service for 2 years. I learned a whole lot of extra English. It wasn't the kind that I could use, but it was acculturating. But in the language itself, it's good actually to know, because if you hit your hammer, or your thumb with a hammer, it's good to know how to say the word. But anyway, so we talked for a little while, and he said, okay, you take these courses. We need industrial. Take these courses. If you can pass them with a C, a better average, you can stay and continue. That's something that only happens in this country. Quintessential American attitude. If you can do it, do it. Here's what you have to do. Do this. Fine. Go ahead. And so I want to announce today that I passed my courses with better than a C average. And continued for the next 2 years at the City College, which is a community college. And then I went to Los Angeles State College, and got my credential, my degree, and got a job at the Yale Unified School District, where I taught for 39 years. And for the first 35 years, nobody knew about my experiences. Nobody knew anything about what I just told you tonight. They didn't know where I was from, but every once in a while, they would ask me around the faculty room, and at lunchtime, somebody would notice that, Leon, do you have an accent? Because it just comes out every now and then. And I would admit, yes, I have an accent. The next question was always, well, where are you from? And I would always give them the same answer. I'm from the East. And nobody ever followed up on it. It's just, hey, that's okay, that's fine. So anyway, then the movie came out, and after the movie came out, it generated a lot of interest in the Holocaust. As a result of the movie, there was all kinds of interest, and people were looking for those who were on the Schindler's List, possibly, and I was in Orange County, and somebody from Orange County, LA Times, contacted the Spielberg company to find out if there was somebody in Orange County. And so they didn't give me my address. They called me and gave me the paper's telephone number. So I had a little piece of paper in my pocket, and my wife finally said, after a couple of weeks, you have to tell them, you do it or you don't. They want to interview me. And I said, I've never done this before. And I was just going to say no. But there's a reporter who was a pretty clever, pretty smart guy. First started talking to me, and I was going to say, I don't do those kind of things. And he said, well, I just want to ask you a little bit about the movie. And so, what was this thing? And he pointed to something. Is that true? Did that really happen? And then he said that. So, how about this other thing? And then my wife tells me that, and then he said, and then finally he said, well, do you mind I came over to your house and we could to tell me these things. And I said, well, fine, how are you going to say no? He came over and then we talked for a little while, and then he said, do you mind if I put a tape recorder there? I said, fine, put it. And so after we talked, we must have talked for a couple of hours, and then I don't know how he could ever make anything out of what I told him. And at the end he said, oh, well, that's very good. This is going to come out in Sunday newspaper. I said, oh, they're right. But by the way, do you mind if I take a picture? I said, no, it's okay. So he goes off to the front door. He says, okay, you can come in now. So these guys with the cameras come in, and they had people, they've been waiting there all this time. Anyway, they took some pictures, and it ended up in the newspaper and came out Sunday, it really did. And on Monday when I went to work, I was attacked by everybody. I said, what happened? You know, I didn't think anybody would be interested in what I had to say, interested in my experiences, or understand them. You know, I'm not really, even now, capable of really explaining just what life was like. Because using words of today to describe something that happened that is so different is pretty hard. Because, you know, being hungry, everybody knows what it is. But that's not what it was then. When I was hungry, there was no food and there was nothing in sight. So it's pretty difficult. But as I said, I was fortunate. I taught for about 5 years before some young lady came to teach English. She was going to stay one semester and move on to New York. And but we were married at the end of that semester, and our plans were messed up. And that was 43 years ago. And we have a son, a daughter. The daughter is married and she has 3 boys. And my son is married recently and we're waiting. So as you can see, the ripple from what Schindler had accomplished are enormous. And what you have accomplished here is also enormous. To sit here all this time and listen to me talk about myself. I think that is unbelievable, and I thank you very much.